Ever wondered about sex life in the Wild West? Today, let's explore the romantic side of the Old West. Imagine dusty trails, cowboy hats, and hearts as wild as the land itself. As we dig into the past, we'll discover stories of love, sex, and adventure that happened from the 1600s when people first settled here to 1912 when the last territories became states and Alaska joined the gang in 1959. Sex had its own journey in those days. So, get ready, because we're about to share some tales that'll take you back to a time when sex was as adventurous as the Wild West. If you're excited about this journey, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe for more stories, and let's ride through history together. Ready? Let's... Ever wondered about the untold stories of prostitution in the Wild West? Picture this. A dusty saloon, the sun dipping below the horizon, and tales of prostitution weaving through the air like the whispers of the prairie wind. In the heart of the Wild West, where every town had its own tale, there existed a narrative often left untold, the story of the resilient women navigating the twists and turns of life on the rugged frontier. As our story unfolds, imagine strolling down those lively streets, not just filled with cowboys and tumbleweeds, but also with women carving out a unique space in this wild theater. It wasn't your typical script. It was a diverse saga featuring establishments ranging from humble joints to places fit for royalty. Each had its own set of characters, adding a splash of color to the canvas of the Wild West. Now here's where it gets interesting. The leading ladies of this unconventional profession were often under 30, not big on books, and education wasn't their strong suit. Picture them, hailing from distant lands, their prices determined not just by looks but by the map of their origins. These unsung heroines, akin to forgotten stars of a bygone era, played a crucial role, just like the miners and railroad workers. Alright, let's step back into the Wild West, where things got even wilder when it came to family planning. Ever wondered why families weren't growing like weeds in those prairies? So here's the lowdown. Condoms existed, but they were like finding gold, way too expensive for most. Now, in this land of risks and mysteries, folks had to get creative with keeping their families the right size. Birth control wasn't just a little pill. It was more like a potion, a mix of strong, sometimes even poisonous stuff from the plants around. A bit of a risky move, but it became the go-to for those steering clear of surprise baby arrivals. Yet for women in certain jobs, it was like walking on a tightrope, a gamble with their job and maybe their life. And the gamble was real. One wrong step could not just end a job, but put lives at risk. Many women faced a tough call, taking a chance during childbirth or using iffy substances to avoid an unplanned pregnancy. Imagine life in the Wild West. Small houses, a single big room, and zero privacy. Families lived in close quarters, sharing everything in that one room. Now think about it. How do you find some alone time when the whole family is practically your roommate? Tricky, right? Enter the idea of privacy, or rather the lack of it. Now, this guy Brian Watson wrote a book, and he spilled the beans on how things changed in Europe during the Reformation. Back then, sharing a bed with family or kids wasn't exactly a rare sight. But surprise, folks like Martin Luther thought, hey, let's make intimacy a private thing, like a sanctuary of secrecy around it. But here's the twist. That kind of privacy came with a price tag, and most folks in the Wild West weren't rolling in dough. Money meant having your own space, but for many, that was just a luxury they couldn't afford. Let's flip on what you might picture in the Old West. Sure, we often think of rugged cowboys, spitting dip, saving damsels, and all that jazz. But here's the plot twist. In the real Wild West, the views on gender roles were as wild as the landscapes. Forget strict labels like homosexual or heterosexual. Folks in the Wild West were more like ill you do you. It wasn't about fitting into a box, but being whoever felt right at the moment. Now, here's the part that might surprise you. Cowboys, those tough guys on horses, had a more open-minded take on things, especially when it came to homosexuality. In Wild West communities, people weren't quick to slap labels on others. Engaging in same-sex activities didn't automatically make you a this is or that. And get this, in places where women were scarce, like a mining camp full of men, some guys would step into women's shoes, literally. Why? For physical pleasure and handling domestic duties, shaking up the whole idea of traditional gender roles. Now, let's talk about something a bit more personal, oral pleasure in the Wild West. You might think, hey, it's a good time, right? Well, not so much. Turns out, folks in the Wild West weren't big on this particular activity, and it wasn't because they hadn't heard about it happening elsewhere in the world. The thing was, people in the Wild West thought of it as a bit too European for their liking. It just wasn't their cup of cowboy coffee, so to speak, even among those in professions where you might expect otherwise. Like the ladies of the night, it wasn't a popular choice. In fact, some of them weren't too thrilled about it and didn't shy away from letting others know. So, as we venture further into the Wild West's private lives, turns out some things were a bit more conservative than you might expect. Ready for more surprising details from the dusty trails? Let's keep unveiling the mysteries of the Old West. All right, let's turn the pages of the Wild West and explore a surprising twist. Cross-dressing. Historian Peter Bogue stumbled upon quite a revelation during his research, and it wasn't just women donning men's attire to make their mark. Bogue uncovered a treasure trove of stories featuring men who hold onto your hats dressed as women. Yep, you heard that right. It might seem a bit backward from the cowboy image we often picture, all John Wayne swagger and boots. Bogue himself was taken aback, admitting, "When I started uncovering all these female-to-male cross-dressers, I also started uncovering hundreds of stories of men who dressed as women. It's like the Wild West had its own unique take on defying expectations." Now, let's talk about a harsh reality in the Old West, the prevalence of sexual assault. It's a sad truth that women faced limited options in both life and work during those times. Most ended up as teachers, nurses, or, unfortunately, in professions like prostitution. Adding to this bleak scenario, women were often treated as socially inferior to men, creating a culture where sexual assault and rape were shockingly common. It was a tough situation for those who experienced such trauma, with very few legal options available to them. Here's the tough part. Many of these women knew that reporting the assaults to the police wouldn't lead to justice. The attackers often went unpunished, and fearing retaliation or societal judgment, the majority chose to remain silent. It's a heartbreaking chapter in the Wild West story, revealing the harsh realities faced by many women at that time. Now, let's take a peek into the limited education scene in the Old West. And it wasn't exactly the go-to place for learning the ins and outs of reproductive anatomy or understanding what instead was. Back in the late 1800s, if you wanted information, you might come across something called marriage manuals. Now, these manuals weren't exactly the best sources. Not only were they pretty inaccurate, but they hammered home the idea that intimacy should only happen within marriage, and they made sure to stress how the big guy upstairs didn't approve of any, let's say, solo ventures due to his disapproval of using a man's seed for anything other than making babies. So imagine this, not much proper education, inaccurate manuals, and a whole lot of emphasis on keeping things within the bounds of marriage. If you wanted to know anything else, well, you'd have to learn by doing. It's a quirky part of the Old West story, where knowledge about certain matters was, let's say, more hands-on than textbook-based.